Yeah, my name is June Bloch. I work with the Apalachicola, or Apalachicola Tribal Town. That was part of my doctoral research. It's actually really interesting to be here after the whole name change fiasco, because when I was in grad school, it wasn't name changes, it was Confederate statues. And so I've seen how when that kind of effort to critically interrogate how we remember the past can spawn anything for up to thousands of white supremacists in homemade riot gear prepared to do what they did. And actually, organizers in Charlottesville would say, you know, the funny thing is that a lot of times the more liberal, for example, city council members, they don't understand that how we remember the past actually does matter. And one thing that the white supremacists get right is they understand it matters. And it's funny to see that kind of, to have that kind of tension running when our experience was so often going to city council, explaining what the, at the time the language was alt-right, was planning. We had very good intelligence with incredible hackers. And to, in spite of all that, to be put in a position where ultimately one of our people was lost their lives, and others, about 16 to 18, were seriously injured and disabled. Which I didn't mean to go off on right then, but such is public speaking for me. So what is ethnic studies and what is Native American studies? I was brought to Cabrillo to do both. Ethnic studies, on the one hand, comes out of student strikes and student movements. In 1968 and 1969, when you had the Third World Liberation Front and the Black Student Union and all these other student groups and the white students as part of the DSA, all started working together to protest racist, what's the word I'm looking for, enrollment practices at San Francisco State and later Berkeley, and launched, as well as many other issues around race and racism. And they were ultimately arguing for a new kind of program in which faculty could teach knowledge that was maintained and essential in marginalized communities. They were building on things like the Black Panthers education program in Oakland, and Native American, in the Red Power movements, work doing things like what were called survival schools, which is where people would gather children in their homes and teach them about treaties and treaty rights and why these things mattered. And so taking that kind of community education and trying to make a program where professors actually would be able to have the self-determination to decide what should be included in the curriculum, and not have to say, oh, this is important because it matters for English in this way or history in this way, but rather it matters for ethnic studies in this way. Now, that sits, you know, Native studies is kind of a not tense, but it's an interesting and complicated relationship, because is Native studies part of ethnic studies, which in many ways it is, as a subfield within ethnic studies. But in other ways, it is really its own thing, with its own set of directions and problems and insights. Before I took this position at Cabrillo, I've been moving around, mostly on the East Coast. I spent a couple years at Brandeis working to build the foundations of Native studies there. And I was so impressed by the students who really took on that work and that mantle. And one of them, Rachel Wang, just a lovely person, ended up being recognized for her contributions because of her work to advocate for Native studies and building that program further, made a zine or a little pamphlet that she distributed to other students talking about what Native studies was. And she pulled this beautiful quote from an article that she had actually found herself. And it says, so what is Native Studies? Well, first of all, Native Studies, it's going to be different than the study of Native American people. Because the study of Native American people casts Indigenous folks as an object to be studied, largely by outsiders. That was the history up to that point. And Native Studies was about interrupting those outsider knowledge practices, those outsider scholarship practices, in order to say, no, we actually should be seizing the power to define our own stories. And those critiques reverberated through all the older and more traditional, quote unquote, fields within academia. My background is in anthropology, and today, if you do anthropology with Native peoples, you have to be engaged with these critiques of what anthropology was. And if you're not doing that, you're not doing good anthropology. And so these movements, these efforts, these insights, and the scholarship really transformed the way universities work and the way scholarship works. And so anyway, Rachel Wing pulls out this quote, and it says, what people often want to know, where does Native Studies fit in the curriculum? And the problem is Native Studies doesn't fit. It was never meant to fit. Native Studies challenges everything that the United States has to offer in terms of education and society. And I just love that quote. Native Studies challenges everything that the United States has to offer in terms of education and society. The author that Rachel Wing was drawing on was Elizabeth Cook Lind. And the article is called Who Stole Native Studies, if anyone is interested in looking it up later. But I love that definition because what Native Studies does is it's almost a form of interruption. It's a way of challenging, the foundational assumptions of how we organize our society in the United States and how we organize education in the United States and law. Because the fundamental premise is that for the United States to exist, it can only exist on land that was taken from Native peoples.
That's right.
And if the United States was to give that back, the United States couldn't exist.
Right.
So that we often think of colonialism as this thing that happened a long time ago that was really bad. And like, oh gosh, that was so horrible. Thank God we've moved on and we have multiculturalism now. maybe we don't. I mean, I don't know what's, like we've seen what's happening in the federal government. We've seen what's happening here. But even that, right? Even that kind of effort to inclusion, if it's going to exist within the United States as a kind of legal construct, as a kind of nation state or government, that means there has to be a commitment to not giving land back. Because otherwise the whole thing falls apart. And what I tell students is maintaining or reproducing that relationship of land dispossession is the technical word I teach them, is a condition of possibility for the United States as a legal project, as a social project. It's a condition of possibility for Cabrillo to exist the way it does. And it's a condition of possibility for the conversation we're having right now. It shapes every aspect of our lives on this deep level. And so when Cook Lind says Native Studies challenges everything the United States has to offer, what she's saying is that we have to start by undermining that erasure that so many people have already talked about today, of the assumption that, first of all, Native peoples don't exist, or they're part of the past. Because if Native peoples don't exist, or maybe even if they're just one minority among many, well then suddenly the way we organize our society based on stolen land, it no longer looks like a moral problem. It just looks normal and natural. And the moment you start questioning that, the moment you even say Native peoples exist, and you start taking land claims and treaty rights seriously, you have to start questioning all of that. And this is really something that gets at the heart of what I think Native Studies does in a way that's really interesting compared to what ethnic studies does. And so the way I think about this, right, is I told you a little bit about the history of ethnic studies. It comes out of student strikes. I think that's such an interesting history for a field of study. And I often ask my students, hey, how did we get from student strikes to here? To, now you have to take a college required class because now, as of the last couple years, we have AP 1460, which was passed in California, that says every CSU graduate and every every community college graduate has to take ethnic studies to graduate. And this is such a lovely example of a very well-intentioned multicultural policy, because who wouldn't want every student to have to take ethnic studies? Surely that's a social good. And I believe that, right? I think that this is important. But then the way that gets put into practice can be kind of messy. Because what it's meant in practice is we take a classroom that was once one of the few places in which people of color's experience was not just put at the center, but their communities and their perspectives, their living experiences was at the center. And with the state requirements, suddenly that whole terrain changes because it's no longer who opts in to take these classes, who wants to learn these things. Now, you have to. Angel asked this question, who is your intended audience? And that just reverberated with me so much. Because the implication in terms of how do we actually do the state mandate is, okay, let's take every person who wants to graduate from Cabrillo, let's put them in a room together in groups of 49 and tell them to talk about race, or else they can't graduate. And that creates a really complicated dynamic. It creates a lot of resistance, and it means that now students of color are in a situation where they have to be exposed to that resistance from some of their white peers, or even with the well-intentioned, but perhaps well-intentioned white peers who perhaps want to be doing the right things and are, believe in multicultural, believe in anti-racism even. But maybe they just haven't thought about it that deeply, and now they have to do their own process, and it's a messy, emotional process. And it's not bad. I mean, I'm happy to work with students through that. But then suddenly students of color no longer have the space that was for them, because who is your intended audience? And we usually don't try to think through that explicitly. So I think what Angel was getting at, right? And what that means is the intended audience is white people. Because the question isn't how do we teach ethnic studies, how do we make this work for everyone? It's based on the assumption of who is this program now for? Why should everyone take ethnic studies? Who is the intended audience? And we've organized an entire way of approaching this around the assumption that the default student is going to be a white student, and that this is for them. Now, Native Studies gives us something really different than that. Perhaps partially because most of my students don't yet realize that the Native Studies classes will meet these requirements. So there still is more opt-in. But, I'm not trying to say one is good or bad. I'm saying it's complicated. There are a lot of things ethnic studies does that are really exciting and good. But there's also these kinds of difficult, complicated pieces. Whereas in Native Studies, I have students come in, and I think one of the first things they realize, if they didn't already know it, and I think they usually know it walking in, is that they just don't know much about Native history at all. And they don't know enough to have an informed opinion. And there's a real embracing of that ignorance and from a place of humility. Because the first step to learning anything is you have to realize you don't already know. Because if you think you already know, you're never going to be able to listen. And I really see students coming to these classes, again, building on Angel, like, wow, that hunger for these other kinds of perspectives, these hunger for Indigenous studies, for Indigenous knowledge. And so this semester, in the first few weeks, I do my normal thing. I show up to class and I say, okay, so here's what the class is about. Hey, also, I want to make sure you guys know, I'm not a Native person. I'm a settler. I'm a white settler. And that doesn't mean I think settler colonialism is good and we should keep doing it. I'm just acknowledging where I sit in this system relative to Indigenous peoples, and that's important for what I bring into the class and how I approach these things. I am perhaps an unwilling settler, is often how I frame it. That's not my idea, but it's a good one that I like drawing on. And the first reaction that students had was, well, I should say, so the first reaction that students had was quite complex and fractured, because you had non-Native students, whites and settler students, who were challenged in that moment. I didn't even realize I was challenging them. I was just talking about myself. But they immediately took that idea and took it to its logical conclusion, which is a good thing. And suddenly they started thinking, oh, what does it mean that I'm a settler? What does it mean that I am on stolen land? And what does it mean that this is how our society works? And like, oh my God, like one student even said, oh my God, it's another thing, another form of oppression to figure out. And so that's happening on one side. And then the Native students are like, oh my God, like, I get that they need to have their process, but like, this is not what I need. And, there's of course ways of doing that. You break them into small groups and, you ask questions and you either formally break them into groups such that like Native folks can talk amongst themselves, or you break them into groups and give different kinds of questions where some non-Native students would be drawn to the questions where they think about what does it mean to talk about being a settler. And non-Native students can avoid it, so they don't have to expose themselves to that kind of harm. But as we kept going in the class, we read this book that, it's a really great book. I wish I was better able to pay attention to it. Unfortunately, with everything happening politically, I'm finding that I've become illiterate, and I just look at pages and I can't process information. But I'll use a screen reader and that helps a little bit. So we're reading this book. It's called Our History is the Future by Nick Estes, and it's about the Water is Life movement and taking the Water is Life movement and going through the entire historical context of Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota history that led up to that. From treaties to boarding schools and forced assimilation policies to land seizures as part of eminent domain due to Army of Engineers developments, into Red Power, into the Water is Life movement. And it's saying, let's look at that long history, because in order to understand this movement, in order to understand Indigenous politics today, we need to know that history. Because how else can it just won't make sense otherwise. And as students did this, and they read this book, they start looking at it and they start saying, wow, so in this movement, in the Standing Rock camp, you have all these people coming together from all different Native nations and non-Native folks, and they're all working together, and it's like all these community institutions, and they're really creating an entire community with infrastructure where people can just live in this other kind of way than what we're used to. And they were actually building a different world. And I'm like, yeah, that's called prefigurative politics. That's a real good point. And in that moment, suddenly they started seeing, well, the question became reframed, right, for non-Native students. It became reframed less as, I'm afraid of land, what about my land? Which is so funny to me because I know most of my students who go to Cabrillo are not landowners, but there is a tendency to identify with the landowning class. and to think of land back as something that would impact them personally in, you know, that kind of way. But suddenly it became clear to everybody, and we were able to have a different kind of conversation, because it was, this is what Indigenous self-determination looks like. This is what it means. This is what it would look like to live under Indigenous law and not settler colonial law. This is what a future could look like. And there's so much hunger today for that question of, this is what a different kind of future could look like. There's a prophecy in Apalachicola, the community I work with. And in that prophecy, in the beginning, early on, the context for the prophecy is, early on there's these star beings, these beings of light that come down and give the people, they help the people remember their original teachings so they can stop killing each other as much and learn to get along in a good way by returning to those original teachings. And when those beings of light came, they gave people gifts of seeds. And those seeds are the senses, the 10 senses, because in Apalachicola, which is a Muskogee community, there are 10 senses. There's, of course, seeing, hearing, tasting. The senses we think of in English, there's also several others, like I forget all of them. One is like huzzalet, or huzzalet, which is like horniness, which is a sense in Muskogee. And the people are meant to cultivate these seeds, right? And these are the seeds of Indigenous knowledge, because it's something that is grounded in that sensory experience. Because how do you relate to other people around you? How do you relate to land? Or how do you relate to non-human communities? Except through your senses. And that is the foundation within this teaching of Indigenous knowledge. And then one day, Europeans came and they scattered the people's houses.
June, 3 more minutes, okay?
Got it. This is my last piece. Thank you. And they scattered the people's houses. And a lot of people stopped cultivating those seeds. You know, a lot of people told they figured, hey, my grandkids will have a better life if I just don't even tell them they're native at this point. And so those seeds withered and died. But other families maintained them and kept growing. And one day, things will get to a point where settlers will actually have to turn to those seeds of Indigenous knowledge and learn how to cultivate them. Because there will be nothing left, and there will be no other option other than extinction. I mean, that's not the word used, but. And doesn't that sound like the world we live in? And so when Nick Estes opens this book, he talks about prophecy as not just something, it's not just about imagining a future, it's about diagnosing problems in the present. And even the title, Our History is the Future. And this is what I think, this is what I see with so much appetite for Native studies at Cabrillo, but I've also seen it in places I've taught before, Agnes Scott College, Brandeis University, the College of Charleston, which is this deep hunger for this recognition that the world we live in is not, well, I don't even think I have to put words for this, you all know, right? There's something deeply apocalyptic about the world that we live in. And that apocalypse isn't anything new, right? It's been happening, as Indigenous philosophers argue. The apocalypse has been going on for the past several hundred years. Now, a lot of non-Native peoples are also realizing, or a lot of white settlers are realizing that they were not excluded from that apocalypse. And there is this real hunger to say, okay, if this is where these belief systems, these worldviews, these ways of organizing our society have taken us, but there's not a sense that there's something else possible. And I think that's where I see something really unique and different in Native Studies, where suddenly students, without even me having to prompt them, they just see, wow, there are really different ways of organizing our society. There is a radically different kind of future we could be working towards. And it's like, again, to take that idea that Native Studies challenges everything the US has to offer, and suddenly there becomes a new set of possibilities that they never could have imagined before because their foundational assumptions were getting in the way. And so when students come with that kind of humility of just being able to say, I don't know enough, I didn't learn much about this, and then we can say, oh, that's a failure of our educational institutions. That's not a personal failing. And then entering that conversation from that perspective means entering with humility and being able to see what you don't know. And even when there is this kind of resistance that comes up for non-Native folks, and then friction in terms of how do we manage that in a classroom where even in Native Studies, Native folks are not usually the majority.
Thank you.
But where it goes by the end is this really key question of what other kinds of worlds could we live in? And every semester, I just see these amazing transformations in the students.
Thank you.
Yay.